Welcome to this Oklahoma SHPO Lunch and Learn presentation. Sorry. I'm Christina Wyckoff, the historical archaeologist and Section 106 coordinator at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. Joining me today are Shannon Cowell, preservation archaeologist, and Ashley Thompson, director of tribal collaboration in research and education. They're both with Archaeology Southwest, and their presentation is Protecting Archaeological Sites, the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, and SaveHistory.org. Thank you both for being here. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting us. We're excited to tell you more about what we're working on.
Yep, thank you for having us. So as Christina mentioned, we work for Archaeology Southwest, and a little bit of background on our organization is that we are a nonprofit organization based in Thanatom and Pasquayaqui lands, aka Tucson, Arizona. Our mission is exploring and protecting heritage places while honoring their diverse values. So we do a lot of different work. We have over 20 full-time staff. As an organization, we practice preservation archaeology. We understand that archaeological resources are non-renewable resources, meaning that once they're impacted, they are forever impacted. And so we use less invasive methods of study. And so we don't really excavate or dig up sites anymore. Another important part of our work is tribal collaboration. And so we collaborate with tribal nations in a number of different capacities as an organization. For example, we have a team of researchers that are full-time preservation archaeologists. And one of their projects is Cyber Southwest, an online archaeological database. And we have a tribal working group that works closely with them to develop that database. We also do advocacy, and so we work on landscape-wide protection of cultural landscapes. So we're a big proponent of Bears Ears, for example, of the 10-mile zone around Chaco. And we're working on a national monument campaign to protect an area known as Great Bend of the Gila, which is west of the Phoenix, Arizona metro area. We do a lot of public outreach. So we have a lot of events in and around Tucson, and we also do some online programming as well. You can watch our archaeology cafes on our YouTube video, and you can also watch them live this upcoming fall and winter season. And then we steward several different sites that have come into our possession. We have a large group of volunteers that help us in our research efforts and in other capacities. And so we're a pretty big organization. We've been around for over 30 years. And so Shannon and I work on the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, or ARPA, as part of our work at Archaeology Southwest, as well as Safe History, which we'll get into a little bit later.
So I work alongside Ashley exclusively on our ARPA Assistance Initiative. It's part of a Bureau of Indian Affairs Cooperative Ecosystem Study Unit agreement, a collaborative project with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Our mission is to eliminate archaeological resource crime from tribal lands, which is no small feat, obviously. It's very complicated, a lot of complex issues coming together. And we make all our decisions using a couple guiding principles I want to share with you so you kind of understand the background of how we operate. First of all, looting is not a victimless crime. It has real impacts on communities and descendants everywhere. Sites are non-renewable, and this is still happening, and it's getting worse. You know, some archaeologists might think a lot of this happened in the 90s, but I think things are kind of increasing with social media and other ways people find out about where sites are, and people using public lands more aggressively. So our work also includes close partnerships that supplement the work of tribal historic preservation officers. So we design and plan all our projects thinking about capacity building, training, and collaboration to make sure we're in line with what tribal experts want to happen to their sites and their lands. Our team includes a handful of archaeologists, myself included, a law enforcement liaison with decades of experience as a tribal ranger and a BIA special agent and investigator. We also have a former assistant U.S. attorney on our team and 2 tribal collaboration directors at Archaeology Southwest, including my colleague Ashley. We also work closely with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Cultural Resource Unit, which was established in 2021 to help combat these crimes. And they have an agent stationed in your neck of the woods too, so we are ready to respond if something happens in Oklahoma. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the law itself that we operate with, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. We'll talk about how to respond to ARPA violations, whether you're a member of the public, an archaeologist, or a tribal historic preservation officer. And we'll also talk a little bit about safe history and some of our work that we've done as a group. So first, we'll start with the driest part, the law itself. Basically, before the Archaeological Resources Protection Act existed, there was a law called the Antiquities Act. And there was actually a big case here in Arizona called U.S. versus Diaz, which fell apart because of some of the shortfalls of the Antiquities Act. Some of the terms were deemed unconstitutionally vague. And it wasn't a successful prosecution. So the Archaeological Resources Protection Act was kind of a new attempt to protect archaeological resources. It has more extensive and comprehensive definitions, bigger penalties, and works quite a bit better on the prosecution end of things. So it's very specific. So its purpose is to protect irreplaceable archaeological resources on sites on federal, public, and Indian lands. And I use the term Indian lands because it's what's in the law. So the definition of archaeological resource is very precise. Any material remains of human life or activities which are at least 100 years old and are of archaeological interest. So both of those items must be proved in any investigation. The way they listed the kind of descriptions of archaeological resources is really comprehensive too. Although it's very focused on archaeological science, not so much perhaps what indigenous communities would want protected. But still, I think this really covers a lot of ground, and they did a good job putting together this list. So it includes kind of non-jargon versions of artifact types, pottery, basketry, bottles, surface or subsurface features, scatters, concentrations. It really covers everything you could find on an archaeological site. And you can look these up online too. So there are 5 elements you must have to have an ARPA felony prosecution. First, the defendant must knowingly excavate, remove, damage, or otherwise alter or deface, or attempt to do so. So we cover an attempt, we cover multiple types of damage. So again, they did a good job making this comprehensive. In the photo, you can see this attempt to use a rock saw to remove a petroglyph. So something like that would be covered. It must be an archaeological resource per the definition discussed earlier. It must be on public or Indian land. And it must have a commercial or archaeological value and the cost of restoration and repair in excess of $500 for a felony, which is a really easy threshold to get to. And I'll explain why in just a minute. And all these things must happen without a permit. So part of ARPA also allows for permits for legitimate archaeologists with credentials to do excavations. So that's another part of ARPA that exists, the more kind of regulatory side. Archaeological value is appraised in terms of the costs of retrieval of the scientific information which would have been obtainable prior to the violation. So in cultural resource management, which I worked in for like 10 years, a lot of private firms are used to putting together budgets to bid on big federal projects that might require surveys or excavations or testing. So basically, to calculate the archaeological value, we calculate the cost of a project to do equivalent excavation that corresponds to the size and location of the damage done by looters. So it can include travel, labor, materials, lab analysis, any kind of testing, dating, everything that we would do in any kind of archaeological investigation for research or in cultural resource management. Commercial value, it can feel a little icky for a lot of archaeologists to calculate because it involves going on eBay, looking at overstreet guides to determine costs for artifacts on the market. We had one case that involved museum materials that really, a lot of them were entire pots, and unfortunately the market price for those was high, but usually the commercial value is pretty low. It's based on whatever we recover during the damage assessment. So whatever we find in the back dirt. Ashley will talk more about damage assessments in a bit. But usually this is pretty low in comparison to the archaeological value and the cost of restoration and repair. So the cost of restoration and repair can include costs incurred for the damage assessment itself, for emergency restoration and repair work, and it can include projected costs. So anything that would need to be done in the future to repair or protect the site. So costs incurred can include the damage assessment, backfilling, any emergency stabilization that you do right after the damage assessment is done. And it can also include, the projected costs can include more stabilization, fencing, signage, any kind of outreach project, ceremonial reburial or reinterment of human remains, travel, labor, all the costs can be included in this calculation. So both the archaeological value and the cost of restoration and repair can get pretty pricey. Pretty much as soon as you step on the site, you're over that $500 threshold. So now we'll move on to part 2, how to respond to a potential ARPA violation. And this will apply whether you're just a member of the public, you're on your own land, or you're an archaeologist or a tribal historic preservation officer. So first of all, safety is number one. You can't forget that, especially in remote places. And if you're on a crime scene, you never know if the suspect is around or going to come back. It's really important not to directly engage with people unless you're law enforcement. A lot of these suspects can be really dangerous. They can be involved in drugs, weapon trafficking, domestic violence. There's a lot of different kinds of, disrespectful activity that correlate with looting and vandalism. So I would never, if people show up on a site, we will probably just leave unless law enforcement is around. And it's important to remember these are crime scenes and you don't want to cause more damage to crime scenes either. So it's really important, if you see really fresh looting or vandalism, to just kind of snap a few photos, take a couple notes, and get out and make sure you are safe. On top of that, these can be remote locations, so there's always critters, weather, other issues to be aware of when you're out in the backcountry. Here are a couple things to look for to identify fresh looting. So in these photos, you can see looters dig these really irregular holes. They're not square or, uniform excavation units like an archaeologist would excavate. Sometimes they'll do some tunneling. and they'll just leave their back dirt to the side. Again, it's really disrespectful. An archaeologist doing legitimate research would have a tarp to collect the back dirt so that we can make the site look as good as we can again after our work. But the looters will just leave things open like this, fresh back dirt and artifacts. Looters will also collect artifacts and sort through them. So in the picture on the right, you can see there's some back dirt turned up at the top of the photo, and then at the bottom there's this concentration of pottery sherds. So this doesn't really happen in nature like that. Usually they're kind of scattered. If it's just natural erosion, they'll kind of scatter over the site surface. But these have been collected and sorted in place. So that's a really good clue. On the picture on the right or the left, there's also artifacts collected on top of a rock and sorted. So again, that's not really going to happen in nature. That's something a person did. And when we're on damage assessments, we have to be really careful that we're just addressing the damage that they did and not accidentally, recording or including things that they didn't do. So we're really looking closely at this kind of evidence to make sure we're responding just to their damage and not any natural kind of erosion or other natural change to the site. They may leave tools. They don't want to get caught with tools in their trucks. So you might find screens, shovels, probes. I don't think these probes are shown on the right-hand photo. And I don't think there's really a legitimate use for those except to find archaeological sites. So those are a pretty good clue that we're looking at someone who's up to no good. And you might also find trash, which is ultimately forensic evidence that can be used in investigations. Also, another type of damage we've looked at increasingly as a team is unpermitted damage by heavy equipment. So this could happen when people are constructing roads or, fiber optic lines, transmission lines. A lot of times it's accidental or there's just miscommunication or some other kind of unfortunate, just failure to communicate. But it's still damage. It's still an ARPA violation. You can deal with it civilly rather than criminally in a lot of cases. This can include vehicle tracks over the surface of a site. On the right-hand side, you see a trench that was dug right through some kind of thermal hearth feature with some fire-cracked rock. And it can include an excavation of, trenches, road blading, any other kind of damage like that as well. So if you are out and about and you observe fresh looting or vandalism, it's really important to take a couple photos, take a couple notes, and get out of there so you don't do further damage. It's also really important to report this. I know sometimes we can get a little complacent and assume that people won't respond, but it's really good for law enforcement and land managers to at least have some kind of record of what's going on their land jurisdiction. So it's always important to report. And Ashley will talk later about, we have a reporting mechanism on our website and a hotline you can use as well. So some of the information you want to capture, you want to be able to describe suspects, gender, height, kind of clothing they're wearing, any other physical characteristics. You want a good location or GPS point for the crime scene. And vehicle descriptions, especially a license plate, color, make, and model. And then a little bit of information about the alleged illegal actions. So are they probing, digging, collecting, spray painting, carving, enough information to prove that there is some kind of violation of ARPA occurring. So again, it's archaeologists are used to working with other archaeologists mostly. Collaborating with law enforcement is new and unusual and has been a learning experience for me. And I think ARPA is one of the only laws that requires this kind of collaboration between an expert witness and law enforcement. So in some ways, it's really interesting and unique. And it's important to remember, archaeologists have to shift our mindset. We're not archaeologists anymore. We're part of an investigation team and the law enforcement officer is in charge. So next, Ashley will talk more about how damage assessments are actually done.
Yep. So oftentimes a team, or I would say all the time, there's a lead archaeologist on a damage assessment team. And so they are responsible for defining the archaeological resource and identifying the damage areas. They're the ones in charge of the archaeology team and processing these damage areas. And so at ARPA violations, there's different types, right? You can have looters' holes, and in that instance, the lead archaeologist would lead the team in processing those holes. They would lead the team in sifting through the back dirt and collecting artifacts, which are evidence, and are responsible for taking notes and keeping track of all of the paperwork. And so we, as a team, a few years ago, published a damage assessment guide that if you are an archaeologist and want to have that, we can give that to you. But in that guide, we have a lot of worksheets that help the lead archaeologist make sure that they've captured everything necessary for the damage assessment fieldwork, because the fieldwork will be used later in the report. And so the lead archaeologist will assess the damage in that report and calculate the costs. And archaeological research and damage assessments are very similar, and that's what this chart is supposed to show you. However, rather than having artifacts and data, those are now actually considered evidence and should be treated as such. And so the law enforcement officer is in charge of that and collecting evidence, and you will want to work closely with them to make sure that the integrity of the case is kept. And then at the end of the field work, rather than writing a research paper or a book, the lead archaeologist will write the damage assessment report. And so as part of the case, the lead archaeologist needs to be really comfortable with the content of this report, because if it does go to trial, they may be asked to be an expert witness, and they would have to answer potential questions about the content of the report, as well as be prepared to be challenged by the defense. So you want to really make sure you do a good and thorough job in the report and in the fieldwork itself. For doing the damage assessment fieldwork, what you're doing out there is basically recording the impacted resources and processing the damaged areas. And so if there are looters piles, for example, they probably left back dirt piles. And so the team will go ahead and process those back dirt piles. You'll see in this photo on the right, there's a screen in the background. And so what we were doing here was gathering all of the back dirt, sifting it, and finding artifacts that we would later count and identify to put in the report. And then you're also out in the field recording the size of the damage area. So you're taking measurements of these holes, or for example, if it wasn't holes, but maybe somebody spray painted a petroglyph or a pictograph panel, you would be taking photographs, you would be measuring them, getting the specific locations of where they are, and recording this all in your notes to be used in the report later on. Another component of damage assessments might be emergency restoration and repair. And so you should do this in consultation with tribal officials. As part of restoration and repair, oftentimes you'll need to stabilize the archaeological resource. And so if there are looters' holes, you might be backfilling those holes and trying to reconstruct the original ground surface contour. Sometimes you will be revegetating the area, Maybe you were doing a lot of field work out there and your team created a trail that wasn't there before. So you'll want to just get the ground back to its original state by potentially replanting seeds. But you'll need to do that in consultation with tribal officials and the land managing agency. And then another component might be putting up physical barriers like fences around the site. Sometimes they will want to have signs up like no trespassing signs, or there might be signs like this one pictured here on the White Mountain Apache reservation that just tell people to respect this place. And then if it's a site that's really important and that is getting looted a lot, there are instances where law enforcement might put up surveillance cameras or monitor the site more regularly to ensure that it's not being damaged further. And then all of that fieldwork will be used in the damage assessment report, which essentially summarizes what you saw and the work that you did out there. And so as the lead archaeologist, they will describe the violation and the archaeological resource that was impacted. Shannon brought up the 5 elements of an ARPA case earlier in the presentation. And so, in your report, you'll want to demonstrate that the violation meets all 5 of those elements, which is that the defendant did knowingly excavate, remove, damage, or otherwise alter or deface. That's the first one. The second is an archaeological resource. The third is from public or Indian lands. The fourth, with a commercial or archaeological value and cost of restoration and repair in excess of $500. And the fifth element being that they did so without a permit. And in this report, you will also calculate the costs for the archaeological value, for the commercial value, as well as for the costs of restoration and repair. The last part of our presentation is about Save History. So Save History is a national outreach and education campaign meant to tackle ARPA violations on tribal lands, but ARPA does apply to both tribal and federal lands, so it can also be used in a federal capacity. Our mission is to end archaeological resource crime, and we do this through several of our goals. The first is tribal collaboration. The second is detection of archaeological resource crime. The third is to respond to archaeological resource crime, and we investigate those. We also have a prevention goal. And so we do a lot of public education online, as well as some in-person events and through our materials. And another goal is to restore damaged sites. And so I'll get into each one of these goals and talk a bit about how we do those things. And so we work very closely with tribal historic preservation and cultural resource offices. We also work with tribal and federal land managers, and we also work with tribal and federal law enforcement, as well as archaeologists, both tribal archaeologists, federal archaeologists, and we have a team of archaeologists. So that first goal of tribal collaboration, one of the things we do is we provide ARPA training opportunities to teach both tribal cultural resource experts and tribal or Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement on how to respond to ARPA violations and how to do a damage assessment. So we've held trainings in a lot of different places, including Oklahoma City, Albuquerque, Tucson, San Bernardino, California, and we've done some online webinars as well for Montana. We also collaborate with tribes for restoration projects. So, for example, currently we're going to be doing a restoration project on the Navajo Nation where we're going to be removing graffiti at a petroglyph site. And we're also working with the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe of Nevada to restore some rock shelter sites that were damaged. In addition, we assist tribes in deterring visitation to sensitive areas by providing signage and other safe history materials they want to distribute to the public or to tribal members. And then if there is a need for a damage assessment on tribal lands, we are there to assist. Our second goal is detection of archaeological resource crime, which can be done a few ways. One way is through surveillance. And so our law enforcement liaison has put up surveillance cameras at highly sensitive areas that get hit by looters. And then he also will monitor sites just by visiting and seeing who's there and monitoring the site to see if there's been any recent damage. Shannon mentioned earlier that you can report ARPA violations through Safe History. And so this is what she was talking about. If you visit safehistory.org, we have a tip line, which is 1-833-END-LOOT. So you can call that number and submit a tip. And then you can also submit a tip online through safehistory.org. You click that submit a tip button, and you can share information like the site location, photos of the damage, the date and time, and any other comments or descriptions that would be helpful for law enforcement. And then that would be routed to law enforcement and they can take it from there. There's a lot, of course, of online auctions and sales going on. And so if you do happen to see that happening on social media or anywhere, please report that as well. Make sure that you get the link of where that's happening, take screenshots for law enforcement personnel, include information such as the username, and then screenshots of the comments, photos, or videos can be really helpful, especially since that content can be deleted oftentimes by the user. So having a screenshot can be helpful for law enforcement. Another one of our goals is to respond to ARPA violations. And so Shannon and I have been on a few damage assessments so far, and we keep getting calls about them. So they keep coming in, but our goal is to stop it to happening. But if it does happen, we're here to assist tribes in responding to these violations. Another one of our goals is prevention, and we do this a few ways. One, through education. So safehistory.org has a blog, and we work with Indigenous people that work with cultural resources to explain how looting and vandalism impacts their communities. And so we share stories from tribal members on the impacts that ARC has on tribes. We also have some learning pages on safehistory.org. Our FAQ page has frequently asked questions. We have a page dedicated to both ARPA and NAGPRA, the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And then we also have a Visit with Respect page, so the public can learn how to respectfully visit and engage with sites if that is allowed for that specific area. We also do outreach. So We sometimes go to events like conferences. We were just in a conference this last weekend where we present Safe History to the public, but we've also put Safe History advertisements in different places. So this weekend, actually, the Santa Fe Indian Market is happening in northern New Mexico. And they put out a print catalog, or I guess it's a magazine, before the event. And so we've bought a full page ad to share anti-looting messaging. And we've also placed Safe History ads and things like hunting tags. We figure that hunters might be seeing looting or vandalism occurring, and we want them to know about us. We have also a lot of materials that we've created, including stickers with our QR code. That's the square on the left that we give to the public. And then we have a children's activity guide that we distribute and some other things. So if you work in a museum or you're with the public a lot and you want some Safe History stuff to distribute, please contact us and we might be able to send you some things. We also have Safe History social media. So we have a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Threads, and YouTube. And just like our website, we just try to educate the public on archaeological resource crime via our social media. And so if you are on those social medias, please go ahead and follow us. And then our final goal is restoration. And so I mentioned we'll be cleaning up some spray paint later this month. These photos were taken at a site north of Tucson where some damage areas had been created decades before, but they had left really large holes in the ground. And so we had a ARPA training at the site where we taught archaeologists, including the Gila River, Otham, Cultural Resources Management Program. We taught some of their staff how to do a damage assessment for an ARPA violation. And then at the end of that field work, we were able to restore the site by backfilling these looters' holes and trying to reconstruct the original ground contour. So this is a before and an after photo. So if you want to get involved with Safe History, please go ahead and like or follow our social medias, visit safehistory.org, reshare our posts. You can distribute Safe History materials if you get some from us. Also, remember that we have a reporting form and a tip line on our website, so don't hesitate to report looting or vandalism or to share that with people you know. And then finally, we are always looking for new content for safehistory.org, specifically our blog. So I know that we worked with some Oklahoma folks in the past, including Deanna Bird of Choctaw Nation, who was so gracious to write a blog for safehistory.org. And so if you have some interesting stories about looting and vandalism or want to get involved further, please contact us. And looks like we have some time for questions and answers.
We do. So the first question we've received says, how effective are surveillance cameras and how effective are volunteer site stewards? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I could take that one. It all depends on the experience level of your whoever's placing the cameras and whoever's being a site steward. So with cameras, really clever placement and concealment are really important. Linking people to sites, linking people to violations is important. Cameras get stolen. It can be a frustrating uphill battle, but they're really important. And again, it's like, how are you measuring effectiveness? Do we want a prosecution? Do we want to just know what's happening? Do we want to know who's out there and what they're doing? There's a lot of information you can collect with things like cameras. And as far as site stewards, again, they need to have good baseline documentation. They need to have some training on how to recognize these things and collect information. Again, is it prosecution, information? What are you looking for? So there's different ways to measure that effectiveness. But I think having some kind of record of damage is so important, even if it doesn't result in prosecution. So I think both are effective and important. It all depends on what kind of resources you have. Cameras can be expensive. If you've got here in Arizona, we have a lot of retirees. We work a lot with the Arizona Site Stewards Program. And so they have a huge base of volunteer site stewards who are really engaged and interested. So their program is super effective in reporting issues.
Can you speak at all about the frequency of these violations, of these crimes? Not necessarily in Oklahoma, but more broadly in your experience in the time that you've been doing this work. How often have you had to respond to these? And do you feel like in your time there that cases are increasing?
Yeah, so I've done some research on Arizona because we're based here. And it's one of the Southwest just gets hit really hard because of the kinds of artifacts and the preservation and things like that. And political disinterest in these issues, unfortunately. So we worked again with the Arizona Site Stewards Program to collect some data. And over a 13-year period, they reported almost 2,200 cases of looting and vandalism. And that's just a tiny fraction of what's actually happening. And in that same time period, there were 3 successful prosecutions, which is pretty disappointing and not in line with what the law says and what the law requires of prosecutors. And I've been on this project personally for about 4 years. And before that, I worked in cultural resource management. So I've done a lot of survey throughout the West. And I've seen a ton of looted sites to the point where it's easy to just get complacent or jaded or kind of overwhelmed by it. And I do think it's getting worse just because we had a lot of movement and outreach by the Park Service and Forest Service and BLM in the 90s, a lot of videos, a lot of signs date to that period. But there just hasn't been the same kind of funding and effort and push recently. And so now people are on social media. We have influencers who kind of teach people how to loot and vandalize and how to skirt the laws. So I think personally, it's getting worse. Ashley may have perspective on that too.
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of the land managers and people that we've talked to have noticed an increase in looting and vandalism at archaeological sites. I also think that with the popularity of outdoor recreation and getting outside, that people are being put into proximity to archaeological sites. So it is really important that we teach the public how to visit with respect, not to create looters' piles, to just leave artifacts where they are without disturbing them, and to let them know that taking artifacts on public lands is illegal under ARPA. And so hopefully our educational component of Save History is helping in that regard, even if a little bit. But yeah, we are really interested in partnering with more tribes and people that interface with the public. So if you do want Save History stuff, please let us know.
We have more questions, but we also have a comment saying it's important for practitioners to note that many times NAGPRA items may also qualify as ARPA items. When there are limitations on enforcement of NAGPRA items, say being trafficked illegally, their qualification as ARPA items can be useful. For example, a sacred shield from the Pueblo of Acoma that was exported overseas was seized using ARPA provisions by the Department of Justice. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or I can just read it and move on.
Yeah, that was a really interesting case. And Shannon mentioned that the Bureau of Indian Affairs now has a cultural resource unit. So they have a unit of special agents that are dedicated to NAGPRA, to ARPA, and are returning or trying to repatriate and return items like that shield. And so the main investigator, Frank Chavez, actually was part of that case and was part of the team that got to return that shield to the Acoma Pueblo.
The next question asks if you can provide a copy of this presentation, which the video will be available on our YouTube page at OK Shippo YouTube page. But the slides, I think, is probably what they mean, or a copy of the ARPA law, or this person says, as a state law enforcement officer, I would like to become better versed in these federal laws. So maybe direct this individual to where they can find these resources.
We've got a lot of resources on the website, safehistory.org, and they link to the official like ECFR location where the laws themselves are posted on the government's website. The Park Service also has a lot of resources as well. So if you Google Archaeological Resources Protection Act, you'll bring up the federal law.
And we have a question asking if working with paleontological excavations add other complications.
It's interesting. We've never worked on that. And I think it's because there's a Paleontological Resources Protection Act that's very similar to ARPA, but I don't think it covers tribal lands. I think that's correct. Don't quote me. You should probably Google that. So we haven't worked on it at all, but it definitely, I think those investigations are parallel to what we do.
The next question asks if Archaeology Southwest has offered training or is offering training to law enforcement staff and prosecutors, because it seems that many may not understand the seriousness of these crimes.
Yep. So we do offer ARPA training for archaeologists, for law enforcement, and for prosecutors. And if you are interested in being a part of those trainings, get in contact with us. Christina, I don't know if our emails were included in the advertisement for this or like our contact information, but we can get that to Christina if you are interested in attending one of our trainings. So we have done 40-hour trainings, week-long in-person training, where we have a former assistant U.S. attorney, Randy Ream, teach about the law, and he's able to answer a lot of the legal questions for ARPA. Then we work also with the BIA Cultural Resource Unit and our law enforcement liaison to help with the more investigation law enforcement side of things during that week. And then you have us, the archaeologists, as well as some of our contractors that teach about how to do a damage assessment. We do a mock field exercise where we set up a mock ARPA violation, and we take a day to form our smaller teams, and each participant gets to be part of a damage assessment team and process a site and go through the steps in the field on what to do during a damage assessment. And so we do provide trainings, and definitely reach out to us if you want to be involved in one of those.
I will say I had the opportunity to participate in one of those trainings, and it was really valuable. So I would encourage anybody who can to do so as well. And if anyone is trying to reach Shannon or Ashley and can't locate their contact information, you can certainly reach out to me directly and I can forward your questions on to them. We do have another question which says, when traveling, how can I be aware of artifacts for sale that might not have come to a shop legally? I travel a lot in the Southwest and sometimes see Native American artifacts for sale, and have often wondered if I'm purchasing something that should instead be in a museum or given back to the tribe.
I would say that, remember, none of it has been taken ethically. None of it was taken with consent. So even if you're not breaking the law, it really doesn't belong on your mantle or whatever. Um, that would be my perspective on it.
Yeah, and it's hard to know where the artifacts came from, and so you might be illegally participating in that trade, and so yeah, just be wary of people that are selling um, artifacts. And one of our advertisements for the Santa Fe market was we're pushing people to stop buying antiquities and instead support today's artists instead. So there's so many contemporary Indigenous artists that create amazing art or even reconstruct artifacts that you could purchase instead, and I think is a good alternative to possibly buying stolen or looted artifacts. I'll also say about that, before I started working on this project or on Save History, I didn't really understand what was driving the looting until you kind of see some of the artifacts and what they're valued at. So there's some pieces that come from Arizona that might be worth $30,000 and above. And so it's actually like the collectors and those sorts of people that are driving this illegal market. And so you want to be aware of that and not supporting ARPA on the ground, because these people are looting to sell to collectors. And so by not partaking in that, you can assure that you're not generating a market for illegally trafficked and stolen artifacts.
Thank you so much. I don't see any new questions, but if folks think of something after this presentation, I hope you'll share your questions with me or with Shannon and Ashley directly. I'm so grateful to you both for being here. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend.